in the section on countries other than India. But I would like to emphasize that this is an ongoing project. There's a lot of data available from the United Nations online on the matrix of world trade from 1900 to 1959. And I've so far analyzed only a small part of it. So this bit of it is about the period of mainly the Great Depression, but going from 1900 to 1935, rather 1938. That's the terminal year of the data that I present. I'm not going into the post-decolonization period. Now let me read a couple of paras and then I'll start showing you the slides and so on. The Indo-War Great Depression was one of the most interesting periods in the history of modern capitalism. It saw an effective transfer of global power from Britain to the US. Apart from plunging the capitalist world into a deflationary spiral of falling output, employment and trade, this period also saw the demise of Britain as the world capitalist leader and the passing of the mantle to an allegedly somewhat reluctant and unprepared USA. Now the impact of the Depression is widely recognized to have been much more severe and more prolonged in US than in Britain. So the mere fact of being caught up in the Depression could not be the main reason for Britain's inability to maintain any longer its long and undisputed position as the leader of world capitalism. The difficulties of maintaining the smooth operation of the international gold standard had started even before the Depression as an outcome of the economic dislocation and imbalances caused by the First World War, which had been well described by Arthur Lewis in his Economic Survey 1919 to 1939. But by the mid-1920s, Britain appeared to be back in its position of undisputed leader of the capitalist world. So what I'm saying here is, some of you will raise the point, but Britain's industrial supremacy had already been conceded to Germany and the US. Britain had become uncompetitive in the late 19th century itself. So we're not talking about that, we are talking really about Britain's role as the capitalist leader. So despite becoming industrially uncompetitive, it was undoubtedly still the world's largest exporter of capital in this period. Now capitalism is not a planned system but has been described as a spontaneous system, subject to periodic crisis, mainly characterized by contraction of aggregate demand and in extreme situations by economic collapse. According to Charles Kindleberger, in his book on the Depression, The World in Depression, in periods of global recession carrying the danger of generalized depression, the task of the world capitalist leader is to either keep its economy open to free imports of distressed goods in order to shore up the level of activity elsewhere, or to export capital to developing economies and so keep up demand in the global economy. But Britain was performing for decades on end, not one, but simultaneously both these functions, up to the mid-1920s. It not only continued to be the largest exporter of capital to Europe and to the developing regions of white settlement, including North America, but it also kept its market open to imports, running very large and increasing current account deficits. Now, running large current account deficits with its major trading partners, as well as investing in them, is not normally compatible. Today, the country with the largest current account deficit, the US, is the world's largest debtor. So we have to understand how Britain was able both to run very large current account deficits with the US, Canada, Latin American countries, the European continent, and at the same time export capital to them. And if we understand that, then we shall also understand why from the second half of the 1920s, it was no longer able to do so and increasingly went into a terminal decline. Now, the analysis by economists in the extant literature of why this happened, why Britain lost its preeminent position, is mainly descriptive. It points to the well-known fact that Britain's invisible earnings registered a sharp decline. But this is not enough. The unique composition of these invisible earnings, namely that a substantial part was not earned by Britain at all, is little understood, because a crucial element of Britain's long and successful innings as world capitalist leader is never analytically taken into account in the literature. This crucial element is the role that its colonies, especially its largest colony, the Indian subcontinent, and later Malaya as well, were made to play to provide without recompense the foreign exchange earnings from their export surplus to the rest of the world, which ensured the relatively smooth functioning of the international payment system based on the gold standard and centered on Britain, while entailing little actual movements of gold. Now there are really two distinct arguments here. All this is by way of introduction. It has been widely noted in the literature that Britain ran current account deficits with its major trade and investment partners on the European continent, the US and Latin America. One part of the argument is that Britain's tropical colonies, especially India, played a very important role, a balancing role in international payments, because these colonies were made to develop large and rising merchandise export surplus vis-à-vis the advanced industrial world, as well as with the developing temperate economies of white settlement. The export surplus earnings of the colonies could be used by Britain to offset its deficits with these regions, because Britain systematically ran what appeared to be a large current account surplus with India and other colonies. Now this balancing role per se is widely recognized today after the work of S.B. Saul, Studies in British Overseas Trade, who remains the only scholar of British trade to build up regional balance of payments data for selected periods and for the major trading regions. So I'll give you a few quotes from...
It's coming.
Sorry? It's coming? So this is the picture, first of all, of India's, no, it's showing something else on my screen. What happened to the graph?
It just was
Yes.
No,
the next one.
the one which we had earlier. Yeah, there it was.
This one. So, oh, this is the main one, right?
Yeah.
All right, it's a little confusing. Everything more high-tech is confusing for me. Okay, so this gives you India's trade surplus from 1833-5 to 1917-18. And the data from Kirti Chaudhary's paper in the Cambridge Economic History of India. This is the long-term series, as you can see. Now, this little blip here, this big blip in fact, in the 1860s, it's very clear to you why there's a sudden rise in the export surplus from India in this period. This is the American Civil War and the cotton boom that India experienced, cotton export boom. And I think you can see basically three periods. One is up to roughly about 1860 or so, starting from 1833, when the trend is slightly rising but not very fast. This is the period when the East India Company's trade monopoly had ended and Britain was facing certain problems in transferring budgetary revenues in the form of export surplus. But then you get the second period from the 1850s up to the end of the century, where the trend is definitely faster of the export surplus. This is the merchandise export surplus, by the way. When I say trade, it doesn't include services here. But then from the beginning of the 20th century, it goes steeply up. In fact, the growth rate of Indian export surplus between 1900 and 1925, the compound growth rate was 7.5% annually, which is a very high growth rate, given the fact that GDP growth rate was below 1.5%, in some periods even negative. So obviously the trade GDP ratio was rising very fast, after 1900 in particular. But the rise had started even before that, during the period of high imperialism. Yeah. So India's rising exchange earnings from the rest of the world were being used systematically by Britain to pay for its own growing deficits on current account with other countries. Indian exports were being promoted to China first in the early 19th century through the Opium Wars. The main exports were opium and yarn. To Japan, the European continent, US, Canada and Latin America. And as we know, the last quarter of the 19th century up to World War I was the period of high imperialism. The bulk of capital exports from Britain, which was the leading global investor, in fact did not come to the tropical colonies at all. It's estimated that hardly about 10% of the total capital holdings Britain had abroad was in the tropical colonies, primarily the India in the broader sense. But the major part of it went to the European continent, to USA, and to the developing countries of recent settlement. Now this, of course, the Nerx's early 1954 article in EJ established that, and subsequent studies have also established that very clearly. And as I've already mentioned, Britain ran not only current account deficits but capital account deficits with these regions. And so it ran up large and increasing BOP deficits with the areas of recent settlement with continental Europe and the USA. Now this balancing role has been widely recognized ever since Saul, oh, what's happening? I think I'm very confused. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going the wrong way all the time. Yeah, so these are just a few quotations which some of you are quite familiar with from Saul's Studies in British Overseas Trade, where Saul says the key to Britain's whole payments pattern lay in India, financing as she probably did more than 2/5 of Britain's total deficits. He's referring to the pre-First World War period when there was a steep increase in export surplus earnings. He goes on to say, it was mainly through India that the British balance of payments found the flexibility essential to a great capital exporting power. And finally, the importance of India's trade to the pattern of world trade balances can hardly be exaggerated. Now, it's difficult for us to realize that this is the period we're talking about, definitely from 1900, but probably from even earlier. I can say from 1900 for a certainty, because the time series is there from the United Nations study. India had the second largest export surplus in the world. The largest was the US. And it maintained this position for decades on end. So it's difficult for us to realize that now, because the whole situation changed drastically during the Depression. That for decade after decade, India's export surplus earnings were not only rising fast, but they maintained the position of being the second largest export surplus earnings in the world after the United States, which was the largest, apart from 1 or 2 stray years after 1900, when I find that Argentina in individual years like 1907 and another year had marginally higher export surplus than India, but otherwise continuously India's was the highest. And then Marcello Di Cecco in his book, the international, what is it called? Gold Standard, I think. Yeah. The International Gold Standard, Money and Empire, in which he has a whole chapter on Indian monetary systems and so on, exchange things, the situation with regard to trade and so forth, where he says India's foreign trade was so structured that it realized a large deficit with Britain and a large surplus with the rest of the world. All right? Now all this is very good, but it is incomplete and somewhat misleading. Because the point is that when Di Cecco says that India's trade was so structured, that is, he's saying correctly, that it is deliberately structured in that manner, which was true, that it realized a large surplus with the rest of the world, that we know, I've shown you the data, and it realized a large deficit with Britain, which is the same as Britain having a large surplus with India. All right? Now, all this is completely normal in multilateral balancing. I mean, a country can well use the current account surpluses it has got from one part of the world to actually export capital to another part of the world. All right? This is part of, as it were, normal multilateral balancing. So this in itself is not telling us the whole story. It is missing. Something is missing. And what is actually missing from both Saul and Di Cecco is the fact that Britain, in fact, did not have a large surplus with India if the normal items of trade are considered. The normal items of trade between two sovereign countries, if these are considered, Britain did not have a surplus with India at all. The surplus for Britain arose purely from its large surplus arose solely from its administratively imposing invisible liabilities on India because India was a colony. This is the thing which is not recognized in the existing literature. In fact, none of these writings, they recognize the balancing role, they recognize how important India's trade was, but they do not recognize the fact of colonial transfers, which is what I'm talking about. It's not there anywhere in the literature, including in Saul. Even Saul's findings are only now very reluctantly being accepted by the economic historians in northern universities. If you find accounts of British industrialization and of the period of high imperialism, you will not find in most of the books emanating from this university even a reference to the role that the tropical colonies, and in particular India, played. So let me run you back to some facts which most of you know already, but I'll go quickly through it. Going back to the important periods of India's trade with Britain. I have to keep looking to the left-hand side of the screen,
right, exactly.
right, rather than the right. This
That's
is the problem.
Right.
And automatically I'm looking at the right. And that is what is causing the problems. Now, from 1600, the year the East India Company was formed, up to the 1820s, India always had an export surplus vis-a-vis Britain. Up to 1765, as you know, the trade brought in silver as payment. Local producers of export goods were underpaid by the company, but exports were not unrequited, they were paid for. However, after 1765, when the company obtained the Diwani of Bengal, the export surplus of British India to Britain was no longer paid for. The payment to Indian peasants and artisans for their cloth and crops came out of taxes collected by the company from these same peasants and artisans. At least a quarter and up to one-third of tax revenues were set aside in the Indian budget for purchasing export goods. Now the main reason I'm running through this is because the same system continues in a more complex form, even in the 20th, up to the 20th century. Now the whole question of re-exports of Indian goods, which paid for Britain's imports of temperate land products. So what is happening in the 20th century, in the late 19th to 20th century, which Saul and Dicek were talking about, is that India's export surplus earnings are paying for Britain's deficits. Now this was not a new thing. It was there right from 1765 onwards. But the mechanism of the transfer was different earlier compared to later. Because earlier, since the East India Company had the monopoly of trade up to the 1830s, it was very simple. It used tax revenues to purchase export goods. Then it imported a much larger volume of goods into Britain than Britain itself could absorb. Part of it was retained within Britain, but the rest was re-exported. And these re-exports were very valuable because the countries from which Britain wished to import strategic naval supplies, food and so on, were countries which had inelastic demand for Britain's domestic exports. So the re-exports of tropical products, which at this time included fine cotton textiles right up to the 1830s, as well as primary products, were in elastic demand on the continent and elsewhere, and therefore Britain could purchase its requirements through re-export. Now one of the interesting things which students who have attended my classes know, but the others don't, is that the re-exports were very important. They boosted the purchasing power of Britain's domestic exports by 55% on average over the entire 18th century. This went up to 65% in the last decade. So the company was directly using tax revenues to purchase goods, part of it being retained in Britain, the rest being used to purchase temperate land goods. And these re-exports as a proportion of Britain's domestic exports amounted to 2/3 by the time you get to the period of Industrial Revolution. And here's the interesting point. I mean, there is a kind of systematic ignoring by the northern economic historians of the re-export trade. In fact, the leading economic historians of Britain, Phyllis Dean and W.A. Cole, in their book, British Economic History Trends and Structure, which is a standard reference, and all those who follow Dean and Cole, you know, there's Crafts in the London School of Economics who has written about this period and so on. What they do is that when they're estimating Britain's trade for the 18th and 19th century, they use a wrong definition of trade. They actually exclude the re-exports both from the import side and the export side of Britain's trade. All right? Now, this is not the definition of trade. The definition of trade they use is simply the imports retained within Britain and Britain's domestic export, the sum of this. Now, this is not the definition of trade which you find in any macroeconomics textbook, open economy, macroeconomics. It is not the definition you find being applied by any international organization talking about trade. That is, if you're looking at the IMF or the World Bank or UNCTAD, none of their publications use this definition. This is the definition which is called in the UN system of classification, special trade. And only Britain does this. Only the British economic historians have done this. The actual definition which is universally applied is general trade. That is, it includes all imports and all exports, right? Now, if you include all imports and all exports, then Britain's trade by 1800 was 80 million pounds. Dean and Cole put it at 50 million pounds. So the difference is not small, it's a huge difference. The correct measure of trade gives you a figure which is 60% higher than the figure that Dean and Cole give. And the amusing thing is, well, it's not amusing, it's sad, is that when Kuznets comes to doing his analysis, you know, Kuznets has this long-term series which he has built up of trade, especially in particular in economic development and cultural change, the appendices. Kuznets is a Nobel laureate, he's a standard reference which people use when they're talking about historical data. Now, Kuznets gives you the special trade for Britain and he gives you general trade for other countries without warning you that the two are not comparable. And this has led to tremendous confusion because modern writers like Yamazawa, who wrote about this flying geese model in Japan, you know, Yamazawa's book, whatever the title is, I've forgotten now. Now, Yamazawa in turn quotes Kuznets and he says that Meiji Japan's degree of trade openness was as high as that of Britain at the time of its industrial revolution. Actually, Meiji Japan's trade GDP ratio, by trade I mean taking the general trade concept, export plus imports, was 14%. And in 1800, Britain's trade GDP ratio was 54%. And Yamazawa actually says they're similar. And he's misled by Kuznets, and Kuznets in turn is misleading you because he's using the Dean and Cole statistics. Okay? So this is just to warn you that nothing that you read is to be taken for granted without looking at the definitions that are being used. And in fact, there has been a phenomenal degree of misleading people as far as trade estimates are concerned. Now, the period I'm talking about, I need to study very carefully because I don't really know, how accurate these data are or whether they're being aggregated properly. So, re-exports were the early form of multilateral trade at the time that colonial trade was monopolized by the chartered companies. But the same principle continues when the monopoly ends. Now, our economic historians have not got to the point, mainly because there is a very simple reason they haven't got to the point that I'm stating. And that is because they do not distinguish between two qualitatively distinct elements of India's trade, which have two distinct parts. One part is that it's trade directly with Britain, and the second part, it is trade with the rest of the world. They do not separate the two. If you look at Pandit's study of balance of payments, if you look at Arun Banerjee's study of balance of payments, which appeared in 1962, Arun Banerjee is looking precisely at the interwar depression period. None of them separate India's trade with Britain, with India's trade with the rest of the world. So they are not able to see that this particular relationship that Saul and Dichekwa were talking about. There's no mention of it anywhere in their books at all. Because conceptually, you have to be conceptually clear before you start doing this division in terms of the statistics. So these two parts, as far as trade with Britain is concerned, in the course of the 1820s to the 1830s, India's direct trade surplus with Britain turned into a deficit, as we know, because machine-made yarn and cloth from Lancashire poured into the compulsorily open Indian market. So India had a direct trade surplus with Britain, which turned into a deficit. But India's trade with the rest of the world remained in substantial surplus, leading to an overall export surplus. That is, it cancelled out the deficit on account of trade with Britain. You get an overall export surplus, which rose fast over the 19th century. I've shown you the long-term trends, because primary exports were being demanded by the developing part of the globe. They had an insatiable demand for raw materials as well as consumption goods. Unfortunately, we do not have the breakup of India's trade into the two parts before 1900 in the secondary sources. So I've already talked about this and this. Now, the fact that Britain did not have a large deficit with that India did not have a large deficit with Britain in any year, if normal trade items are considered, I will illustrate by giving some indicative figures here. In 1910, India's deficit with Britain on merchandise and gold was 19 million pounds. The credit that Britain actually claimed vis-à-vis India was 60 million pounds. This was the total of India's export surplus earnings from the world. So what explains the difference? If you take dividends and so on, and that's very small, because the investment by Britain in India was very small. So dividends and other, as it were, items of this kind, and we are not taking things like freight and insurance and so forth, because we are taking in any case import CIF. Okay? Those are already being included. So things like dividends and so on British capital invested in India was hardly about 2 million pounds or so at this stage. But this difference is of the order of 40 million pounds. So what is it? It is the invisible liabilities which are imposed, administratively imposed by government, in order to siphon off India's foreign exchange earnings for its own use. Or you take the period of World War I. Now, the First World War was a period when exports boomed from India, from China, and from Japan, because the belligerent countries in Europe had a huge demand for jute, for sandbags. They demanded millions of sandbags while they were slaughtering each other in the trenches in France, and there was demand for other goods as well. So India's export surplus earnings went up, but what happened to it? It's only recently that when we look at the data, because the double entry system, everything is meticulously entered. Over 4 years of the war, India's export surplus earnings, which surged, was appropriated by Britain under a special head. A gift from British India to Britain of 100 million pounds, which no Indian knew anything about. You know, no Indian and no Indian economic historians, even those who were studying the data, because they were only looking at home charges and so on. They were not looking for any other items. They were looking at the standard items, home charges, etc., which remained at, the total remained at 25 billion. So that is something which had always puzzled me, and then I came across this, that 100 million pounds that we gifted to Britain, one of the poorest countries in the world, gifted to the industrially most advanced country. Or you take the year 1928, India's deficit with Britain on merchandise plus gold, and the deficit was only because India was a compulsorily open market into which Britain was pouring its manufactures. It was not allowed to protect itself, otherwise it wouldn't have had a merchandise deficit with Britain either. So its total merchandise plus gold deficit in 1928 was 38 million pounds. The credit claimed was 126 million pounds. What's the difference? 88 million pounds of investments. Now these are just illustrative. This is something which went on year after year after year. So the extra claims by Britain on India were annual, politically imposed invisible liabilities or tribute under very many heads, not just the well-known home charges. These heads have not been fully investigated and documented so far. All these invisible charges were pitched somewhat higher than the annual exchange surplus earnings, obliging India to borrow. Now if we look at Arun Banerjee's, my introduction itself is taking too long. I'll wind up this and go on to the interwar period in a moment. Well, this is the interwar period. If we look at Arun Banerjee's estimates of merchandise trade surplus and the invisibles, over the period 1922-3 to 1938-9, the blue line is showing you the trade surplus that India was earning. And you can see that there's a steep decline, there's a rise and then there's a steep decline reflecting the fall in global primary product prices. So Indian exports were getting impacted by that, by the depression in the primary product prices, which started, in fact, before the stock market crash and before the industrial depression. but the total invisibles are the bottom figure. So as India's export surplus rises, the invisible liabilities are also made to rise, get bigger. It's going down. So the two cancel each other out, or tend to cancel each other out. There's a special thing here because there are gold exports after 1931. So gold is a special thing. But this is illustrative of what was generally happening even before 1922. In fact, happening right from 1765 onwards, if you like. Rather, the 1830s onwards, if you like. That is, no matter how high India's export surplus earnings rose, it was never allowed to have a current account surplus. Never. Except one period when the export surplus surge was so great that Britain could not think of ways of taking all of it. And there was a very small amount of import of capital borrowing by Britain from India. But otherwise, the export surplus earnings were more than siphoned off by imposing invisible liabilities. The invisible liabilities were calibrated to export surplus earnings. And usually, you could not have year-by-year calibration because export surplus is being determined by a lot of factors which are not under the control of the colonial government. World expansionary or recessionary conditions and so on, what is happening to competitors, etc. So it can't actually control it that closely. What it could control, however, is the invisible liabilities that it placed on the colony. So normally you find that there's hardly much of a lag actually in the calibration. It operated in a sort of asymmetric manner. There was a floor below which the demands on India's export surplus were not allowed to fall, which was of course the home charges plus everything else, all right? But there was no corresponding ceiling. So what happened was that if there was a period when our export surplus went up unusually, then immediately the home charges, etc., were supplemented by additional demands. Like the demand, like this gift from, 100 million pounds, how do you show it? How do you show it? It's very difficult to show that amount of money. It's a huge sum. So you put it as a gift, an additional, it's not a demand, it's a sort of, you say that the Indians have kindly given us a gift of 100 million pounds. Okay? But the other way, supposing world recessionary conditions means that India's export surplus dips below the normal transfer, the home charges plus dividends plus interest and all that, then the demand is not lowered, but the difference is treated as India's debt to Britain, as borrowing from Britain, which of course then adds to interest liabilities in future. So the whole thing operates in this asymmetric manner. And the funny thing is that even though Arun Banerjee's own figures show this, he does not draw the analytical conclusion, which he should have done. Over the entire period, India's aggregate commodity surplus, merchandise plus gold, was almost equal to invisible liabilities. Now this is remarkable, it doesn't happen by accident. It would be a 1 in a million chance if it happened automatically. Alright? It was administratively determined. So you see the total of merchandise and gold surplus is some 1,500 crore rupees. The total of invisible liabilities is 1,500 crore rupees plus 332 crores. 1,500 plus 32.6, say 33 crores. So the borrowing which was necessitated by India, because the demands were pitched somewhat higher than India's ability to meet it through its export surplus earnings, was about 30 crores. Now 30 crores amounts to about 2% of the total export surplus earnings. Just calculate, 298 divided by 15,027. You'll get around 2%, just a little below 2%. Alright. So the inflow was also quite small because the whole idea was to siphon off these exchange earnings, which were not earned by Britain in any sense at all. So it is pure, it's a pure transfer. And what was the financial mechanism of the transfer? The financial mechanism was through council bills. The people also had foreigners who were importing from India also had the option of paying us in gold. But the council bill mechanism was designed in such a manner that they found it cheaper to buy council bills from the Secretary of State for India in London and send the council bills to India rather than to ship gold in payment. So whether you were an American importer or a German or whatever, you paid for your imports from India by purchasing council bills which were issued by the Secretary of State for India in London in your own currency. These were sterling bills, they were converted to sterling. And these bills, however, when they were sent to India, were encashable only in rupees. And the rupees in turn came out of the budget. That is, the Indian exporters would take the council bill and encash and get their rupees from the exchange banks. Exchange banks in turn would submit it to the treasury, and the treasury in turn would provide the sums which were notified in the Indian budget as expenditure incurred abroad. So I tried to get the the macroeconomics of the system, how the normal balance equation has to be, the relation between the savings investment balance, the budgetary balance and the trade balance have to be modified, and it's there in the paper I published, the free lunch, as an appendix. So this is just a very quick running through, because if you read that it will be clear to you. Basically I'm saying that in a colonial economy, the total G is government expenditure, T is revenues, which I assume to be taxation revenues, S is private savings, I is private investment, NX is the short form of net exports of goods and services, alright? So the standard balance equation that you have, or identity if you like. But in a colonial economy, the government expenditure has two parts. One is GD, which is the domestic, which is normal in any country. The other is GA, which is there only in a colonized country, not in any other sovereign country, which is the government expenditures designated as being incurred outside the country, abroad. Such a budgetary head does not exist in a sovereign country. So that is why I am saying these relations are quite different from relations between sovereign nations. And similarly, the net exports have to be divided into two parts. The net export of goods and services term. NX1 is the total of merchandise and services export surplus earnings of India. And NX2, and that is always positive. What the colonial government does is to try and push your exports as much as possible. It wants to maximize NX1, wants India to earn more and more foreign exchange from the rest of the world. Alright? And at the same time, it is imposing invisible liabilities, and that is the NX2 part. NX1 is equalized to NX2. Or rather, NX2, as we have seen, is either equal to NX1 or somewhat pitched a little more than NX1, forcing the country to borrow. Okay? Alright? And the payment for the export surplus to the local producers is coming out of GA. So there is a direct link between the fiscal system and the trade system in a colonized economy, and this direct link does not exist in trade between two sovereign nations. So what is happening is exactly the same, but in a little more complex form as what was happening when the East India Company had the monopoly. That is, the exporters of Indian goods, thank you, were being paid, so-called paid in quotation marks, out of the taxes they themselves had given to the government. So they were not being paid at all. Analytically speaking, their export surplus was being taken as the commodity equivalent of tax. And the same system persists. Once it becomes more complex, when Indian exports are going all over the world people are making payments, so it's not a question of re-exports by one company. It's now a question of your foreign exchange coming in from all over the world, but this particular mechanism made sure that none of the export surplus earnings were made available to Indian nationals for their use. The export surplus earnings piled up in the account of the Secretary for State for India in London. Alright? And the local producers of export surplus were paid out of the tax revenues that they themselves had contributed. Okay? So it's a very smart system. It's so smart that apart from Professor Amyo Bagchi and Professor Irfan Habib, nobody else in this country has understood it so far. Okay, carry on, Rohit, please. Alright. Now we are coming to our period where I'm giving you the proposition I'm putting forward as an explanation for Britain's demise as the world capitalist leader is the following. That actually the entire international payment system, based on the gold standard, which required very little actual movements of gold, was floating essentially on the colonized countries' export earnings, which were made to rise over time. And I'm only taking India, but if you add on Malaya, Malaya was earning 20 million pounds annually in terms of forex earnings for Britain's benefit. If you add on the other smaller colonies, then it's a huge amount of money that Britain was appropriating. So it was all floating on that, right? On the ability of Britain, through its political control, to appropriate the forex earnings of its colonies from the rest of the world, and to be able therefore to offset not only its own current account deficits, but to actually export capital. What was Britain? It was nothing. Once it lost its colonies, it just sinks to the rank of a second ranking power. So the pound sterling being considered as good as gold, the confidence that the capitalist world had in Britain as the world capitalist leader ultimately rested on its political control of empire, on its ability to extract the products of the labor of, 150 million Indians, something like 10 times the labor force in Britain itself, and if you add all the other colonies, then it's even more. All right. So that was the solid basis on which the pound sterling was considered to be as good as gold, and Britain could continue decade after decade as the world leader. Now, this is the UN study. There was a very famous study carried out by, I think he's a Swedish economist, Folk Hilgert, which was done for the League of Nations. It was published in 1942 on the multilateral trading system. All right. Now, it's not easy to get a matrix of world trade, because you have to get the imports and exports from every country in the world which has reliable statistics. So you don't get the matrix of world trade even today, except for selected years. All right? You get individual country time series for individual countries' exports and imports. Services, again, are quite difficult. But to get a matrix of world trade, which are the surplus countries, which are the deficits, in very specific terms, you don't get a time series of that, as far as I'm aware. So this became very famous for this reason. And the arrows are pointing. The picture is very clear. It's a network of world trade. The arrows are pointing away from the country or region which have the trade surpluses. And the arrows are pointing towards the region which have the deficits. All right? Now, I do not think even the title of this is correct, because I don't think you have an arrow pointing from United Kingdom to the tropics unless it includes services. So again, as I've said, this is an ongoing research. I have to really go deeply into the data to see what are the definitions being used. But the picture this revealed was pretty clear. All the arrows are pointing away from the tropics. The tropics are, India is included in the tropics, are earning forex from the United States, from regions of recent settlement, from Germany, from Europe except Germany and UK, which have been separately shown. There is only one region with which the tropics have a deficit. That is UK. Because UK had political control of the major part of the tropics, and it was imposing these liabilities. Now, it did not have a deficit of this magnitude if you consider the merchandise trade deficit alone. So that's why I'm saying that there's something wrong here. I have to look into the data as well. Now, the only other country in the world which had export surpluses was the US. You see all the arrows pointing away to the other regions and countries. The only region with which US has a deficit is the tropics. Otherwise, it's earning surpluses from everywhere else. Now, the only export surplus regions are the tropics on the one hand and the US on the other. Everyone else is running deficits. And what you see, there are two figures here. One is that when the tropics are exporting, you're taking the exports FOB. When the other side is importing, the figures are imports CIF. So the difference is arising because of the freight insurance cost. Okay, that's why you have two sets of figures. All right. Now, a similar network of world trade is available from the UN. from which firstly, and it's in, this is the 1962 publication of the UN. It's not a publication, it's available online. Now this gives you a time series from 1900 right up to 1959 of exports and imports, and fortunately for Britain, it also gives you the re-exports. So the Kuznets fallacy and the Dean and Cole fallacy is avoided in this UN data. We can calculate the actual surpluses correctly, not the misleading figures that Dean and Cole and Kuznets give, which are gross underestimates of Britain's trade. Or rather, we can also calculate the extent of the deficits correctly in the case of Britain. The data are in million US dollars. At that time, the exchange rate of sterling to dollar was 4.7 to 4.8 dollars to 1 pound sterling. You can see that after Britain lost its preeminent position, its currency devalued very sharply vis-a-vis dollar. And the Indian exchange rate at that time was 30 cents to a rupee, roughly. All right. Now, this is the period when India's merchandise trade balance with the world is shooting up. As I said, 7.5% annual growth rate. Why? Because the rest of the world was industrializing. It had an apparently insatiable demand for raw materials in particular, but also food grains. India was a net exporter of food grains. There was food deficit. And these are basic data from which this graph is derived. And I'm taking here, not individual years, I'm taking 3-year averages. That's why 1900 to 01, 1902 to 04, and so on. All right. I'm getting confused again. So here you have the Indian subcontinent's trade balance, excluding its trade with UK, which you can see is shooting up, and it reaches its highest level of nearly $500 million US dollars, 497 US dollars by 1928. Now, by around 1925, primary product prices had started declining, but India's trade balance was still going up because actually it was exporting more volume, even though the unit value was falling. But that could not be maintained forever, and as prices continue to fall, you have a collapse of India's export surplus levels. This is the UK trade balance with the world. All right? And you can see how huge it is. And this is the share of 1 in 2. That is, what proportion of UK's deficits can we say India would have been financing? And Saul is absolutely right. He was saying about pre-war that it was through India that Britain found the flexibility to export capital. And India was financing at least about 40% of Britain's total deficit. That is the figure I also get. 40%, rising from 17% in 1900. Declines by 1928 to 26.5, then it collapses to only 7.1 and 9.1. Now the proposition I'm putting forward is very simple. It is that one of the major elements in Britain's demise as the world capitalist leader has not been taken into account in the existing literature, because you do not find any reference to the collapse of India's exchange earnings. Now, the moment you realize that it was basically India's exchange earnings, along with those of the other colonies, which was keeping the entire payment system afloat, and which was providing the solid backing to the pound sterling being considered as good as gold, rock solid, totally reliable. Now, when those exchange earnings disappear, then what happens? Basically, the entire substructure which was holding up the imperial payment system collapses. All right? And if you go to the this is what is happening between 1924 and 1938. A precipitous decline in India's merchandise balances with the world. Okay? Very sharp. Actually, there were countries which had even sharper decline. There is an article by S.G. Triantis which is titled Cyclical Fluctuations in Trade Balances of Primary Exporting Countries, or something like that. He's talking about the Great Depression as being a cyclical phenomenon, which is a bit much. But anyway, he documents this, and he says he documents 6 other countries or regions, mainly in Latin America, which had an even sharper decline of exchange earnings than India did. And of course, they started losing gold. There was massive export of gold from these countries. And they were forced to devalue, they were forced to go off the pound sterling, go off gold. Britain itself was forced to go off gold only in 1931. And the major reason was this, according to me. But I don't think that this is a reason which is actually given much prominence in the literature. But this was one of the major reasons why Britain was no longer able. It tried very hard. It tried to maintain, to play its role by, it kept its markets open, it did not go in for protection. Unlike the US, which passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1931, closing its markets. A Smoot-Hawley tariff, I think, was a very general kind of a tariff, right, which raised barriers to exports from most of the world. The US was not interested in playing that role. Britain kept its markets open. It continued to run current account deficits. But how long? When the major source of its ability to do so, the colonies' exchange earnings, were going into this kind of precipitous collapse. All right. So this is the very simple proposition that I want to place before you, that we need to explore these data and we need to establish this proposition on a very sound basis, because this is something that has been ignored by the economics profession. And they have ignored it because they have not understood the question of colonial transfers at all. It does not figure conceptually in their analysis anyway. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. Oh, and a last word about gold movements. Now, if you read people like Dicheco, or what's the name of that German economist? Rothemund. Rothemund has a book on the Great Depression, in which he says that Britain's problems were solved because of gold exports from India. All right? India was on balance a net importer of gold. Now, a lot of these imports were not on private account actually. Some of it, particularly before the First World War, was an account of government importing gold in order to build up the gold exchange, the exchange standard reserve that India had. A lot of it was for coinage. But anyway, India was a net importer of gold. And the gold is always treated as part of commodities. So you have to modify the merchandise balance with the gold balance. Now all this changed dramatically with the Great Depression because there was acute agrarian crisis, industry was not affected that badly, and there was disinvestment owing to distress. People who were faced with falling prices, who were not able to make ends meet, sold off whatever little assets they had, and you had massive gold outflow from India. So Rothemund and others say, well, it solved Britain's problems. In other words, they are saying something which is going directly against what I'm saying. I don't think it solved Britain's problem, because you have to look at the relative magnitude of the decline. Look at the peak, and look at the magnitude of that decline from the peak. If that level had continued, look at the difference between the situation in 1928 and the situation by 1932. Just in 4 years. Or really the situation in 1925 and 1932. Just a matter of 5 or 6 years. Right? Precipitous decline. That is not compensated by the gold exports, large though they were. Number one. Number two, India's merchandise balances never recovered, nor did those of other countries before the Second World War intervened. Whereas the gold exports had to taper off, which they did by 1937. So I think my proposition still stands, despite the gold movements. Okay. Other data, which I won't bother you with. I mean, you have masses of data still there for analysis from this data source. So comments, questions, welcome.
The way in the later part of 19th century or early part of 20th century, the way Britain appropriated India's foreign exchange earnings by, as you said, that directly India didn't import that gold, they had to buy that papers and like these things you were saying. So by that way, India actually never got any gold. So isn't it?
No, we were looking at the merchandise balances. I was comparing the merchandise balances with the invisibles. Additionally, there's a gold, well, it never got that gold in what sense? I mean, if you look at import of gold, there was import of gold.
From India.
Net import of gold into India.
No, so, and then Britain imposed some home charges or whatever charges. So, on what did it impose? Because already it had taken the...
No. Home charges are part of what I am calling the total invisible liabilities. Alright? But the total invisible liabilities are much more than home charges. Home charges is what you find in the literature. But there, you see, home charges amounted to only 26 million pounds, even as late as 1925. By 1928, it had gone up to some 28 million pounds. But the actual credit Britain claimed was 126 million pounds. Okay, so home charges are telling you only a part of the invisible liabilities. Where is the rest? It is hidden away there in the accounts, because they were all very meticulous accounts keepers. You had double entry bookkeeping, you know, debits and credits balanced. So it's all there. It's just that people have not excavated those data. They have not brought it out. And the reason they have not brought it out is you will only bring it out if you conceptually know it's there. Ideas precede empirical work. If you don't even know it's there, if that question doesn't arise in your mind, you won't look for it. You follow? I mean, before Keynes wrote, nobody collected the information which would allow you to build up national income accounts. First, the conceptual basis has to exist, and then people go and look for those items. So I'm saying something very strong. I'm saying that our historians are very good. They have looked at archival material, they've dug into the material, but they did not have the conceptual basis which would have enabled them to dig deep enough and find these items. And just by chance, this 100 million came up. The 100 million pound gift was not known to R.C. Dutt. I don't know when he died actually. Ramesh Chandra Dutt, was he even alive after the First World War? But you know, all those who followed Ramesh Dutt and you looked at the Indian data, they were not aware of the 100 million pounds gifted by India to Britain. And that's not a small amount, that would be billions of pounds if you expressed it in today's prices. So there is a gold mine out there waiting to be explored, but unfortunately, number one, those who work on economic history don't know economics. And the economists who know economics don't work on economic history, or they're not interested. And number two, it requires a great deal of, you have to know not only your own country's economic history, you have to know global economic history as well. So it's very demanding. And what our economic historians have generally done, I won't say every economic historian doesn't know economic history, Professor Bagchi does. And even though Irfan Saab is not an economist, because he's a Marxist, he has that insight of understanding what is the notion of surplus. So he has been able to understand it. For the earlier period, he doesn't deal with the later capital exports period of imperialism. At least with the earlier periods, he's very clear what is happening. All right. So there are individuals who understand it. But all of them have focused on India, India's trade. Now, only looking at India's trade won't give you the picture. You have to look at global trade. That is why Saul's study was so important. Because he was the first, and so far he published 50 years ago. He's still the only person who has looked at global trade flows, as far as I'm aware. The global trade balances, and tried to build up balance of payment series. But you know, 50 years ago, he published in 1960, what computational facilities did we have? We had nothing. We didn't have computers. It was very difficult to build it up. So he doesn't have time series. Just gives you a cross-sectional picture for 1880, for 1910, like that. And it doesn't extend beyond the First World War. Have I answered your question? That the total of invisible liabilities which Britain imposed was far, far larger than we had imagined. much bigger. So we have to look at the items under which it imposes.
No, but my question is, it is already been appropriated by that above method. That is, by the fact that importer of Indian goods has to purchase the bills from India. So it's at the beginning only that it is being
No, not
appropriated.
all of it. Not all of it is not all the export surplus is being paid for through council bills. The British government tried its hardest to make council bills the only instrument. It only succeeded in making it the major instrument. Okay, it was the major instrument, but it was not the only instrument. There were gold movements as well. Okay. And the any other questions?
And I suppose that doesn't include invisibles, isn't it? I mean, you bought the council bills essentially to pay for the goods, isn't it? Or because then the home charges and other things, the gift and so on, their council bills don't enter. It's a transfer from the British government in India to some agency through the British Central Bank. I mean, how does it?
No. The whole point is that how is the export surplus of goods being paid for to the local producers? So what we are saying is the major part of it is not being paid for at all because it is coming out of taxes that the producers themselves have paid in. So it is tax finance transfer. I mean, if you just look at trade data, you will think exports are exports, imports are imports. Alright? But you have to look at the total mechanism of how the export surplus is being paid for. Now, when I used to give rudimentary versions of this paper earlier, ending, not coming up to the depression period but earlier, ending in the 19th century, I had faculty members in the seminar telling me, but you know, you had a legal system, Indian producers were paid prices for the goods that were taken from them. So how can you say it was costless for Britain? Now, Indian producers were being paid, yes, but that payment was coming out of taxes they themselves had given to the state, which is not the case in any sovereign country. I mean, today, if we have an export surplus, our producers are not going to be, no, our government does not set aside a part of the budgetary revenues. And what is the proportion they set aside? It varied between 25 to 30% of total budgetary revenues was being set aside year after year after year in order to pay the local producers for their exports. You see how clever the mechanism was.
Probably that is why India had deficit vis-a-vis Britain, because exports were undervalued, in the sense that
No, it had a deficit vis-a-vis Britain because it was kept a compulsorily open market. It was not allowed to protect itself. And the British followed a policy of, making India buy from Britain through its stores purchase policy. That is, the government was a major spender after all. And government policy was to buy from Britain even when British goods were more expensive than continental goods. So that is why it had a deficit. I mean, India was made to serve as a market directly vis-a-vis Britain. But it was an overall earner of foreign exchange to a much larger extent to the rest of the world, from the rest of the world.
No, I am saying from the import side, yes. But since exportables were also cheaper, because part of the export bill has already been made by the domestic fellow, the producers.
Yeah, no, the export surplus is being financed out of the taxation. Because the imports, you see, if you take the exports that India is making to Britain, then it's also importing from Britain. Alright? Now, of course, people like Professor Bhatia would say that a lot of the imports India had from Britain, its import deficit directly with Britain, actually would not have been there at all if there was not colonial trade, because a lot of it was goods that the Indian population didn't need. That is, Indian imports were not only overvalued, a lot of it was unnecessary. I mean, things like empty glass bottles, shiploads of empty glass bottles, so that the British could fill it with liquor. Shiploads of chandeliers, shiploads of marble statuary. The Indians didn't need marble statues and empty glass bottles and chandeliers and things like that. I mean, those were imports which served the ruling class, that is the British ruling class. So he would argue that actually you have to adjust Indian imports for that. Indian imports which were necessary for India were much lower also. But I'm not going into all that. I'm saying, okay, we are not interfering with the merchandise export and import, we are not adjusting for that at all. So we are getting an underestimate of the extent of the transfer, essentially. But anyway, as far as the macroeconomic thing is concerned, it's a bit difficult to understand because it's so different from what we normally have. Am I going back or am I going forward? I'm going back. Yeah. So here, it's a bit difficult to understand because it's so peculiar that the total T is the total revenues, all right? Of the total revenues, a quarter to 30% is being set aside and is not being spent domestically under the normal heads. So actually, even though the policy was balancing the budget is not balanced. It is in surplus year after year. If the normal budgetary expenditures are concerned, it's a surplus budget. Okay? And the surplus budget is exercising a strongly deflationary impact domestically. And that deflationary impact is necessary because you need to, as far as the British are concerned, they need to squeeze domestic consumption, to restrict domestic consumption in order to release the resources for the export goods. So one way it reflects itself, the squeeze on domestic consumption, because year after year you have a surplus budget, is that the per capita food grains consumption goes down very drastically. Per capita income is virtually stagnant within the economy at a time when the export surplus is growing at 7.5% per annum. Okay? So you're using, operating a surplus budget because 25 to 30% of the total revenues you're getting from the Indian people are simply being used for financing the export surplus for as far as local producers are concerned. Anyway, you people are the experts in macroeconomics, you work out what the macroeconomics of the colonial economy is very different from trade and investment within of sovereign countries. And my argument is that there is a direct link which is established right from 1765 between the fiscal system and the trade system.
GA increases over time.
Sorry?
Expenditure incurred abroad, government expenditure
Is GA.
It increases over time.
Well, they try to increase it over time. What the government is trying to do in colonial India, first of all, it tries to raise taxes, to get as much taxes as possible. And then it tries to raise the proportion of GA to total taxes. The proportion which is being transferred. And it does increase. It starts at some 16-17% in the early 19th century and it goes up to something like 27-28% by 1928. So the proportion is increasing. That's the whole attempt internally, is to raise taxes and to raise the proportion of GA to the total taxes. And this is matched externally by getting India to export as much as it can to the countries with which Britain is running deficits. So that it is able to defray its own deficits through Indian export earnings. But then if India is exporting, what happens to those who are exporting these goods? They have to be paid. So they are paid. The attempt is to get them to take their payment and foreign importers to make their payment primarily in the form of this bill of exchange, which is a sterling bill encashable only in rupees, where the rupees are then paid in by the Indian exporters to the exchange banks. Exchange banks in turn pay it into the treasury. The treasury pays them the money out of the budget. And I have to look in detail at the size of the budgetary size does not increase very much. So as the GA part is increasing, it looks as though the domestic spending part must be declining also, which again has the effect of depressing domestic demand. It has a deflationary impact. And definitely during the period of the Great Depression, there were very severe cuts in expenditures on irrigation, on the railways and so on. That is, the productive expenditure part out of the budget was slashed during the Depression years. But the GA part, the expenditure incurred abroad, that was maintained. in the depths of the depression, India was still paying out huge amounts of whatever before the decline in the exchange earnings set in. It was paying its exchange earnings and it was exporting distressed gold. Both.
Ma'am, as you argued that it was the collapse of the Indian exchange which finally led to the collapse of the imperial payment system, where they can't maintain, over period they couldn't maintain the large amount of deficit, so the confidence went down and the stability of the currency also went down. So, I am just drawing this analogy whether it's correct or not, but can you say in today's context where the current US dollar is a universal method of payment system, where most of countries, developing countries, due to this volatile capital flow, they have to keep huge amount of reserve. So there is in a way that indirectly they are giving loan to the US holder because they have to keep that amount because they have to pay out the US treasury. So can we say that suppose tomorrow that we have effective capital control and we are able to manage this, reduce this amount of payment is going to the US, the stability of US currency can go down?
Not so much us as China. They're scared of China more than they are of us because the Chinese holdings of securities is so much larger than ours. But yes, in fact, that is what I say in my paper, which I presented to the Congress, that even though the situation with the US as world capitalist leader is completely different now, because the US does not have direct political control. So Britain could maintain the fiction, and it still maintains the fiction as far as their own economists are concerned, that it was exporting capital out of its resources, out of legitimate earnings, which was quite false because it had no earnings. It was using political control to appropriate our earnings, the earnings of the poorest countries in the world. But it could maintain that fiction at that time because of direct political control. Now the US is in a more vulnerable position because it does not have direct political control. And therefore it is clear to all that it is able to run this huge current account deficits only by borrowing. And the people from whom it borrows is not just the advanced surplus countries like Japan and Germany, those are the surplus countries I suppose, but the poorest countries in the world, China and India as well. So the basic thing is not changed, that the poorest countries in the world are supporting the balance of payments of the richest country in the world. And the dollar being considered as good as gold now is not considered as good as gold, it's more volatile as you say, is very strongly dependent on that. That thing remains, that basic similarity remains.
Well, actually the British Empire ran a trade surplus.
Sorry?
You can say the British Empire ran a trade surplus.
British Empire ran a trade, no. Where did the British Empire run a trade?
British Empire.
No, Empire included very diverse countries, which is what this diagram is important because it's showing you how diverse these regions were. Qualitatively, you have to distinguish between the tropical colonies, that's why tropics are put together in one place, where Britain invested very little, and the industrializing nations which industrialized after Britain, France, Germany, later Russia, USA, they were all late industrializers compared to Britain, and they industrialized on the basis of British capital exports. You know? Okay, so they're quite, and not only France, Britain, Russia and so on, but also Argentina, Australia, South Africa, which were all regions of white settlement. And the British never settled in large numbers in the tropics, they didn't like the climate. But they grabbed land and they settled in very large numbers, as you know, in North America, South Africa, Australia. Australia is also hot, but they managed to get rid of the aborigines, so they had a lot of area to settle in. And places like Argentina. So empire doesn't give you the solution. Specifically the tropical colonies, if you look at the regions of recent settlement, since they were also developing, they had import surpluses from the tropics. And they had export surpluses to the more developed world, to Germany, to United Kingdom, Germany, United Kingdom were all importing, the industrializing countries. The lead industrializer as well as the late industrializers were all importing from the recent settlement regions. The recent settlement regions, however, were importing from us. And on the whole, their trade was balanced. The imports equal the exports. The big deficit region was Britain and the European continent. Big surplus regions were US and the tropics. So don't talk about empire, because empire was very, very different, heterogeneous. A lot of capital flows went to regions of recent settlement also.
And what about Ireland?
Ireland, you see, after 1820, they don't give you data separately for Ireland. Ireland was a British colony. In fact, effectively, it remained a British colony. Right up into the whenever, you had the Irish Republican Army and so on going on. But you see, United Kingdom, what they do is they lump together Britain and Ireland after 1820 in terms of the statistics. So if you do a detailed study of UK, you will have to disaggregate, and then you can see what Ireland was. I think it continued to be a net exporter to Britain. So it was an underdeveloped country relative to Britain. I suspect, because it certainly was so in the 19th century. Whether that continues into the 20th or not, I have not investigated. Okay? Okay. Thank you very much for your patience.